street demonstrations and protests. They have become increasingly violent. Is your heart and your head still with the protest movement?
Yes, very much so. I think it is a pity that there is escalating violence, both on the part of the protesters, although involving a very small number of people, but also on the part of the police. The police are increasingly brutal and unrestrained in exercise of their powers. But I'm very much behind the underlying causes of this movement. It is about Hong Kong's fight to defend basic freedoms, civil liberties, and to demand political participation through fair and open elections on the basis of one man, one vote, all of which are promised in the Joint Declaration and Hong Kong's Basic Law, the Basic Law which is our mini-constitution.
Well, you've just defined the protest movement's objectives in very broad terms, but it seems to me, if I remember back to June of this year, there was one very clear motivation and demand for the demonstrators, and that was to get the extradition bill that appeared to be about to be passed, and which would have allowed, of course, criminals in Hong Kong, suspects, to be sent to the Chinese mainland for trial. The main objective was to get that quashed, and now the chief executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, has withdrawn the bill. So why are people still on the streets?
Well, first of all, Carrie Lam has only acceded after 3 months of continuing protest to one of the 5 public demands. You have to look at the underlying concern behind the people's objection to the extradition bill. The extradition bill removes the firewall between the legal system in Hong Kong under the rule of law and the legal system as it exists in the mainland. People felt that they were no longer even safe in their own beds because you could be extradited across the border, face unfair trials, no legal representation, trumped-up charges, and made to confess to crimes that you did not commit.
Well, understood, Madam Chan, but the news is it's gone. This is a victory for you, but you don't seem to be prepared to take victory for what it really is. I mean, that's why so many people are finding it hard to understand, having won this real victory, why you can't enter a dialogue and take your people off the streets.
Very simple reason, because first of all, this withdrawal has come very late in the day after 3 months of protest. The public sentiment has moved from the extradition bill to an even more serious matter, and that is an inquiry, an independent inquiry by a reputable judge into the root causes of this political crisis, unprecedented in Hong Kong's history since the handover, particularly at the excessive use of force by the police. The government insists on entrusting this task to the Independent Police Complaints Council that is heavily loaded in favor of pro-Beijing members. It can only investigate police complaints and not the root causes of this current trouble, much less look into, for example, even the protesters' increasing violence. There are accusations of foreign interference. Well, an independent commission would look into that too.
Yes, it just seems to me.
Besides that, let me just finish. Besides that, there are 2 other demands. May be difficult for the government to concede, but at the very least, people are now agitating for political participation, for universal suffrage, something, again, which is enshrined in the Basic Law, our mini-constitution. I
understand your objectives, but I am, in a sense, talking about the strategy of defiance. Now, in 2014, we saw people on the streets, many of them students, young people, with their colourful umbrellas, and in the end, they kept the demonstrations going for a while. while, there was some sort of a dialogue which seemed pretty unsatisfactory, but ultimately they went home and got on with their daily lives. This time around, the mentality seems very different. People aren't just carrying umbrellas, they're carrying Molotov cocktails sometimes. They're hurling rocks at the police. They appear intent on confrontation. There is a very different mindset.
I don't agree with your description that this is a movement of protest and confrontation. Why is it protest and confrontation when all the protesters are asking for is for Beijing to keep to the promises they made to the people of Hong Kong in the Joint Declaration and in the Basic Law, guaranteeing our freedoms, our civil liberties?
Come back to the instances of violence. And of course, much of the violence we have seen on video has been perpetrated by the Hong Kong police, but some of it has been perpetrated by protesters and demonstrators as well. There's the infamous case of the video showing the violent beating of a man who appeared to be a Chinese journalist at Hong Kong airport. Now that plays into a narrative that Beijing is pushing, that ultimately there is a terrorism at work in Hong Kong, and they have a duty, working of course with the Special Administrative Region government in Hong Kong, to quash terrorism. You may be playing into their hands.
That may be so. I don't agree with violence, and I certainly condemn violence. But I would point out that the SAR government and Beijing have a very easy solution to stop violence, and that is that you have to listen to Hong Kong people. Which government, which responsible government refuses to listen to the voices of 2 million people taking to the streets? That's a quarter of Hong Kong's population. So if you want to stop the violence, the easy way out is for Beijing to allow our chief executive some latitude. It is futile to assert that one country, two systems is working well when our chief executive doesn't even have the freedom to step down to take responsibility for this debacle.
You've labelled Carrie Lam as incompetent and useless and being run effectively direct from Beijing. You clearly think she has no credibility or legitimacy whatsoever.
Mr. Saka, those are your words. They are not mine. I originally said forcing Carrie to step down, who would step into her shoes. But since she has shown no indication of making some of the very difficult positions to, as it were, lower the temperature and find a way through this current impasse, then she should make way for somebody else.
Let me ask you this.
There is no leadership at the moment. Effectively, Hong Kong at the moment is a rudderless ship, and the captain has left the bridge.
You may say that you don't see Beijing as the enemy, but it seems to me Beijing certainly now sees you as their enemy. If one looks at the state press in China, mainland China, you've been fingered as one of a quote-unquote gang of four, very senior Hong Kongers who is said to be orchestrating the protest movement. The highest legal enforcement body in China, the Central Political and Legal Affairs Commission, has accused you and the other three of 14 deadly sins, including colluding with the US and UK and inciting young people in the city. Are you feeling intimidated and frightened right now?
Well, Mr. Saka, you clearly do not know me, and you do not know my experiences and my history. But I hope you can see that this is all part of the state propaganda machinery. And simply because I don't toe the line and say things that Beijing may not wish to hear, they've mounted this smear campaign, yes, intimidation, harassment, not just only of myself, but of my family members. But the more they do of this sort of smearing, the more they convince Hong Kong people that the only way they're going to have a future is to insist on the faithful implementation of two systems, a system that is entirely different from that in the mainland.
Isn't it true that Beijing holds all the cards here? It is going to be arguably the most powerful economy of the 21st century. Admittedly, it's in a trade war with the United States right now, but ultimately the international community is hardly going to see it in its interest to make a major intervention in the Hong Kong crisis when it needs a very strong economic relationship with Beijing.
Well, I sincerely hope that Britain, the United States, and other international communities are not simply going to capitulate and go on bended knees simply because China is currently the world's second largest entity. The world has to face up to how they are going to engage in and deal with this rising China. And surely it is in the interest of the world as a whole, but also I suggest in the interest of my country, that China should increasingly, sooner rather than later, embrace some universal values, particularly respect for human dignity, fundamental rights and freedoms. That would be good for the nation as a whole and for the rest of the world.
But if I may say so, Madam Chan, that's a very interesting proposition you've put to me there, because it seems to me you're getting very close to saying that you believe the pro-democracy demonstrations and protests in Hong Kong can be some sort of model to emulate, some sort of inspiration for people in mainland China, and that you want what you're doing to be a message to people across the whole country of China. Is that what you're really saying? Because that would be very inflammatory as far as President Xi Jinping is concerned.
Those are, again, your words. What I am saying is, to the extent that Beijing allows Hong Kong genuine universal suffrage, and we are seen to be making a success of a liberal democratic Hong Kong, then Beijing officials might like to use the Hong Kong model in terms of developing a model of representative government that would suit the country's interests as a whole.
You're entering very dangerous territory there, though, aren't you? And if Beijing really does see Hong Kong as some sort of model, then surely the impulse from President Xi on down is going to be to ensure that your pro-democracy movement does not succeed.
Well, I'm not forcing this upon mainland China. I'm simply just saying that if we are seen to be making a success of this, surely it is also a successful point that Beijing can make in terms of making a success of one country, two systems.
Well, when you say success,
in the longer run, I hope that my country will learn to embrace some universal values.
You say success.
That is my hope.
You say success, but surely many people in Hong Kong will be looking at the current state of the economy, with tourist numbers down dramatically in August as anti-government protests have swept through the city, credit ratings being downgraded, growth figures for Hong Kong being downgraded as well. A lot of Hong Kongers, even if they might support some of the principles you've outlined with me, they're going to be gravely concerned that the continued unrest is going to affect them very materially.
In certain respects, yes, I would accept that perhaps the tourism industry is directly impacted because tourists are afraid to come to Hong Kong in view of what has been described as riots. But overall, as a small externally oriented economy, Hong Kong cannot escape what is happening worldwide. And surely one of the main reasons for a slowing economy is the ongoing trade dispute between the United States and China. And there are other reasons. It's very convenient to blame it